Om Shanti. And welcome to Interview with a Raj Yogi. And tonight our topic is the value of the subtle. So we'll kind of explore what all that means. But first start with a reflection. I observe as I go through the day. I'm very affected by what my physical senses detect. And even as I sit here with the eyes and ears open, my attention is easily drawn by any changes in the physical environment around me. A noise can pull my thoughts. Movement in the environment can pull my thoughts. So affected by the physical. And yet, what really determines my quality of life isn't physical at all. Thoughts, feelings, memories, all non-physical, but very impactful. As I sit here now, I experience the impact, the power of thoughts. I can use thoughts to create a peaceful experience or a peaceless one. The invisible, that which is not physical, has incredible impact on the quality of my life. Om Shanti.
Shanti. Good evening and welcome to Interview with Raj Yogi. So, tonight's topic, as Judy mentioned, the value of the subtle. And just from your reflection that we just went through, and then you were sharing about thoughts, feelings. Is this something that is like, why is this relevant for souls? I think maybe many think, but yeah, these are important things, but to actually be invested in it, it seems to be perhaps maybe the part of this conversation, the value of it. So if you were to try to sell it like it is, something as if it was a commercial, you're selling this amazing product, and they always share that you can't really sell something unless you really actually buy into it. You don't really believe in it. So what is it for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I can sell it to anyone.
It's more about what impact it has been on you.
I think there's always a couple of things. I always feel I have a lot of faith in souls, and I think they know this at least on some level. But then we're always left with the what to do about it, and that can feel overwhelming. So I kind of ignore the whole thing.
Mm.
We've gotten to the point where, the power of science and just where our awareness is at, we find it a lot easier to manipulate the physical. So if I'm wanting to feel secure or comfortable, I'll have some comfort food, right? So that's just easier for us to manipulate the physical. But I think deep down we know that it's got to do with issues inside. And as we go into spirituality and learn more about how we operate as a spirit, then it becomes less overwhelming. But at first, it's like, I know that there's no point in worrying. I know my thoughts are causing me a lot, but I don't know what to do about it. So I'll start to manipulate the physical again. And even, the topic of feeling stressed or anxious or overwhelmed, okay, well, then I'll take a holiday or I'll reduce my workload. But I never really, these are all very external or physical changes, but it's something internal, more subtle, we say, that's actually causing the distress. But I need some tools to navigate through that environment of the subtle. So that's what spirituality can give us.
Do you feel is the resistance then? Because maybe some actually don't really feel it's really relevant as well. Or as you're sharing, it seems overwhelming to even,
Mm.
well, okay, I don't even know where to start. What's causing this resistance? Is that even a useful question then?
I think anytime we're looking at making a change on anything, there's going to be resistance. Not that we can be completely ready to roll, quite happy, but the habits or addictions or familiarity can fight back and start to influence us through our own thoughts. So it's really just the status quo that's resisting change.
It's interesting you were sharing about, and it was during the reflection that my thoughts can affect how I experience everything. But
Mm-hmm.
many find, actually, many who come through that door to the center, I don't have any control over my thoughts. Or they might even just, they won't use this word because this is a word that's often maybe in the study. I don't know how to control the subtle, basically, which is what this
Mm-hmm.
is all about.
Yeah. I know that my first exposure to what I later learned was spirituality, I think I've shared before, but was reading about a soul who's in a very difficult situation, had no control over their physical environment whatsoever, none. And all that they had control over, or could work with, was their attitudes and thoughts and perceptions. And that's what they did. They knew their quality of life, the most valuable thing in their life at that moment. Their life depended on getting those thoughts and attitudes aligned, or there'd be no quality of life whatsoever. And this turned out to be the foundation of a very famous psychoanalytical discipline, in the book Quest for the Meaning of Life. But if, being in that extreme situation, realizing, I wonder if we need, I don't want people to have to get into that extreme situation because it's actually the case all the time. So it's a deep decision inside. It's funny, this again, actually thinking that way, I don't have control. Look at the power of subtle. I keep thinking to myself, I don't have control. And I
Right.
actually surrender to that thought. I
Mm.
believe it. Whether or not it's actually true doesn't matter. It's the fact that I keep thinking it. And imagine saying, wait a minute, I do, or I can develop, or just some other. They're so powerful how we talk to ourselves. And we are talking to ourselves constantly throughout the day. and not realizing. And as you take the course, you realize where those thoughts are coming
Mm-hmm.
from. But the impact they're having is absolutely phenomenal. Our it's running the show. The subtle is running the show, quite frankly. So if we could just somehow realize that, and acknowledge that as spiritual beings we can develop the power. As soon as I stop telling myself I can't, that
Mm-hmm.
would be very helpful. But I want to learn. There's a famous scene in the Gita, where Krishna, is telling Arjun that he has to do something, a certain battle that he must fight. And Arjun looks at what he's going to be asked to do, and he's like a great warrior, but he's saying, I can't do what you're asking me to do. This is just too ridiculous what you're telling me to do. And Krishna is saying, but you have to. This is your dharma. This is what you're built to do. And rather than just sort of moping and sulking and saying, I can't do it, the famous words that Arjun utters is, teach me. And I love that particular scene, teach me. So just the thought of being open to learn can go a very far way.
I wouldn't want this to digress, but it is related when you were sharing. It was something that's, tonight we were listening to a senior student share,
Mm.
and a very super brief background. She was talking about, I'll use the word endurance because tolerance may have a funny feeling for some, but she was saying, I'm able to endure through something. And then she says, don't just tell yourself you can't. She's like, I can do this. Now, how does one handle maybe saying it and not really feeling it? And maybe, if anything, that I've noticed for those who are in the West, um, there is really a pull for authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And so saying it and not feeling it,
Mm-hmm.
what's the missing link? Obviously, we're not looking for technique,
Mm.
but what are we looking for?
Well, first off, that again points to the power of the subtle,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I can say something, but it won't have any impact
Mm-hmm.
because there's no subtle power behind it. So that's the whole point of the subtle. It's why we work with soul consciousness so much. Until I become just the way the soul is built, and something that we have called an intellect, until I become soul conscious, it's very challenging for me to accept certain things. And until I accept them, I can't put my heart behind them. So the minute I become soul conscious, then I'm more open to accepting these basically very elevating thoughts about the self and capacities, because with soul consciousness goes, God, I am a child of God. So we learn about our
Mm-hmm.
capacities, etc. So it's no small thing. Again, this is the most valuable and subtle thing, is consciousness, awareness. It's remarkably powerful. This is why the mother can lift a burning car. Their baby is under, because of the consciousness, I am the mother of that baby. That's it. On any other day, she wouldn't, if it was someone else, she wouldn't be. But, that moment, the consciousness is very, very powerful. So when we're so conscious, we have a completely different experience of ourselves, and we're able to accept thoughts, put our heart behind thoughts we could not before.
It's a great point that you share because maybe it kind of brings us back to review.
Mm.
Especially with facilitating the course, you hear lots, I mean, lots of different responses and experiences of what soul consciousness means.
Mm-hmm.
And that conversation always goes, is it thinking? Is it imagination? What is it? How do I know if I'm actually in the right room and not just doing something and perceiving I'm doing the right thing? Because from what you're sharing, there should be capacity that's awakening.
Mm-hmm. Um, the best definition of soul consciousness that I heard was, it's me. That clearly isn't going to work well necessarily. But we're holding some consciousness very naturally without any effort. And that consciousness is that I am a body. So in this example, that I am Judy and I am this body and I have these parents and these siblings and I do this, a certain age, gender. It comes very naturally. We don't even have to think about it. And on the basis of that, I perceive I have I exhibit certain capacities. So we're very used to throwing ourselves into a consciousness. What we're saying when we say we are a soul is I'm not those things, but I still exist. I'm a spiritual being, and we start to connect to peace and love, the qualities of the soul. So, although it might be a very nice reflection, it is a massive, massive reframing of the self. So I can't just think I'm peaceful and still I'm Judy, but I'm peaceful. This isn't
Mm-hmm.
quite going far
Mm-hmm.
enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to mean that everything I had called mine isn't mine. And it's a bit like, I'm in a situation where I feel comfortable, familiar. I wouldn't say comfortable. I think it's actually quite uncomfortable, but it's very familiar. And I'm going to have to give up that familiarity. And what we're suggesting is for something better. But I won't be able to taste it's something better until I try it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm now caught betwixt and between. And it's usually not till crisis that souls are willing to give it a try. But it's something better than where I'm stuck right now. So it's really fear. It isn't any technique. It isn't any long-winded explanations of soul. It's just there is fear such that we won't break out of the familiar consciousness.
But it seems like it really determines what determines it is how the quality of what I'm experiencing, what I'm practicing.
Yeah. One of the courses we do is Raj Yoga New, where you get to look. That we again have this capacity called the intellect, and we can use it to. It's the intellect is built to seek attainment or benefit. It's actually built to do that. It's a decision making tool, and we make decisions on whatever we perceive to be beneficial. We could be completely off the mark, but whatever we perceive. And so, if I can get the intellect to think through what happens when I think I'm a soul, what happens when I think I'm a body, and if it can understand, it's a business decision actually, which side is more profitable. If I can get it online, that's really helpful, really helpful. There'll still be a lot of resistance and fear, but if I can be convinced, okay, this actually is where dignity happens. This is not where if I can get that far. And
Mm.
so one of the things that we find useful is as the world seems to fall apart, it's actually helping us to see that soul consciousness is the way, because we're at the point now where we actually will kill each other on the basis of our physical identity. So that's, yes, a horrible state, but actually it's a really good argument for not thinking of ourselves as the bodies. So, we kind of have to think through, if I think I'm the body, what does that mean? Well, for number one thing, it means I die. But then there's a whole other other bad stuff. If I think I'm the soul, what does that mean? And once I've got that clear, then I think once the intellect's online, then it gets easier to overcome or at least to work through the fear.
Your sharing reminds me of that there's actually so much in terms of subtle connections, subtle significances, all that stuff that we may not even realize the implications for whether it is I believe that I'm just this image, this body, or whether I really am just open to wanting to experience.
Well, and it fascinates me because again, we're very selective in what we choose to believe. We could say, the biggest joke, of course, is there was a debate between two college students, and one was debating God does exist, and the other one debating God does not exist. And just before going into the debate, the one who's going to argue that God does not exist, he whispers, under his breath, he whispers, God help me in this debate. So, sometimes we say, okay, please send me good wishes that I get the job, or so we kind of know that the subtle is valuable selectively,
Mm.
but we don't consistently live from that place.
What do you, when you were sharing, and I was using that example, it's a great point that you mentioned, or sharing about one of the senior students who was sharing this evening about, and how do you really talk to yourself inside? And when she was using the context of enduring, that
Mm-hmm.
no, I have that capacity to be able to in given situations. And when you were talking about the reason why it doesn't seem to have any powers because it lacks subtle power.
Mm-hmm.
What is that subtle power? What are some subtle things internally that I need to pay attention to be able to strengthen my practice of soul consciousness?
We have two treasures: thoughts, which we're talking about a lot, and time. And sometimes what happens is we'll sit for meditation and we'll have the thoughts that we're supposed to have. It doesn't seem like we're necessarily, our heart's behind it, or there's
Mm-hmm.
fear. And what we need to do actually is look at time outside of meditation. Is what am I thinking outside of those seated times? I compare this, I don't know why this example always comes to my mind, but baseball players. I always found it very odd that they sit in the dugout, because it's just completely at odds with my understanding as a dancer. So they sit in the dugout, and then they're going to go up into the batting circle and into out to bat with absolutely no warm up. Not only are they going to have to swing their bat like a crazy person and hit this ball, but then they're going to sprint full throttle if they make contact with no warm up. I just think it's a recipe to injure, pull something. And I feel we kind of ask our subtle capacities, our mind, to do the same thing. During the day, I'm not paying any subtle attention to what's going on in my head. But when I sit for meditation, I suddenly expect my mind to do subtle gymnastics. So, one of the things I think is super important is developing the habit, and it takes time, but using my time to develop the habit of paying attention to how I think outside of seated meditation times. Those are really valuable, the seated times. But to be able to move forward and not sort of stay stuck, I have to kind of look, am I, the way I'm living, sort of walking around the rest of the day, is it at odds with what
Mm.
I'm trying to do when seated? Do I just continue to think I'm a role in relationships, and then I sit down and think I'm a soul? It's very hard to gain any mastery over the subtle if
Mm-hmm.
I'm working at odds with myself this way.
Makes me think about even when you're sharing about perhaps one hasn't really sorted out if soul consciousness is just something that I just do on the side,
Mm-hmm.
or I call it meditation, because there's certainly many schools of thought of meditation, but um, like it seems to be a priority issue, which seems to be also a subtle thing too.
It is, again, back to, the value of the subtle. And this is going to be a bit of a connecting the dots. But what we sometimes, we'll say to souls, oh, I'm having this problem at work, or we say, well, have you tried being soul conscious? And I know the feeling is, what does soul consciousness have to do with paying the bills or getting the job done at work? It's got nothing to do with it.
Mm.
And that means I haven't really understood how the subtle works with respect to the physical. And this ties into a subtle law called the law of karma as well. But in essence, that I am the creator of every situation I'm in. And I created that situation by the actions I performed. And the actions started or were seated in thoughts and awareness. So it has everything to do with whatever is going on in my life. And it's not just superficially having, okay, good thoughts or positive thoughts, but really quite deep how this law of karma goes, because it looks at the purity of my thoughts, the purity of my intention. So the subtle is extremely powerful in shaping our lives. So if I'm in a situation where I'm having difficulty paying bills, the law of karma will tell me to back up the bus and look at what was the consciousness that led
Mm.
to the situation I'm in. And a different consciousness could actually address the situation I'm in.
Mm. It's interesting, so much of the subtle we kind of take for granted. And perhaps going back to that point, the value of the subtle. And some actually know that. I work at a place where many individuals experience a lot of pain. And of course, that's not the intention of tonight's session, is to convince anyone, or even though I was jokingly saying sell the value of the subtle. But there are some who really do feel that there is, that has nothing to do with anything that's important, I suppose. And for each of us, there is some sense of resistance inside that may not be overt and extreme to that extent. But it was interesting because today in one of the classes, it was about making excuses.
Mm.
And how do I deal with that, especially since the subtle matters so much? How do I approach myself, the resistance inside, knowing that the subtle matters, using what is subtle matters, how I use it matters?
Yeah, this is where I think understanding is king, and why Raj Yoga is presented as a spiritual study. So we want to gain spiritual understanding. That's going to help me a lot in how I manage myself, working through these different
Mm.
issues inside, inner dynamics, hidden attitudes and perspectives. It's quite fascinating, actually, what's going on at the subtle level. We sometimes compare it to an iceberg,
Mm.
that at the very gross level, I'm like, I'm going to do this. And then, but I seem to go in the opposite direction. There's some subtle forces that I need to understand so I can work with them in a subtle or non-violent way. So understanding is king. So part of saying I'm a soul is to understand how I, the soul, works and what's happened to me, the soul, at a subtle level. What's happened? That information is so valuable. And we're not talking about psychology or psychoanalysis, we're talking about spiritual understanding.
Mhm. When this topic came up, the value of subtle actually was connected to last week's topic. But one of the reasons why it came up was in terms of valuing the subtle, in terms of just the subtle work I do on myself.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there seems to be a lack of trust that many can have, that, I'm working so much and trying to fix myself and trying to be able to do some things that's really, really invisible. But and not being able to value that, it seems ego can override so much. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
like I want to see results.
Mm-hmm. Deep down, there is, we say, subtle unworthiness that's kind of at the root of all of this. And so we were talking today about there being just one healer at the subtle level, and that, of course, is the Supreme Soul, the Eternal Surgeon. But really need to work with that subtle being to help me to be able to help myself. Um, it's just, again, the more that you study Raj Yoga, you kind of realize we're missing a huge chunk of information in terms of caring for ourselves when we ignore the subtleties. The spiritual is the term we use. We need a lot of spiritual understanding and spiritual support or power to really reach that peace and happiness we're seeking. It's just To think it's going to happen without the subtle, I think is at best just a temporary attainment.
Mhm. What do you feel in regards to the subtle in terms of our interactions and our
Mm.
actions?
It was funny. I had a very interesting conversation today. Um, so we have this ongoing thing about, wait lists for classes and such. And um, so the instructor of the class the previous evening came up to me and said, and she said, "Oh, we missed you in class last night." She knows that I can't be there as an instructor. We are denied access if it's called, and she knows this, of course, isn't it? And I said, "Yeah, no, I know the class was full." And she says, "You know what's really sad?" She said, "Someone didn't show up." And I remember thinking in my head, Judy could be in the class. And I said, "Yeah, but you never know whether." Just yeah, but people need to think about each other. They can't be self-absorbed. They need to think about each other. That if they can't come, then they need to let us know so that we can. I said, yeah, it's true. And I've heard so much. I think that this conversation on the subtle is very relevant to these times because it's such a game of attitudes. And I've heard so much that in terms of how we relate to each other, if we don't start to think about each other, and which is going to require subtlety, that is, in this case, freedom from my own desires. If we don't go beyond that, we really are going to fall apart. It's just going to get ugly.
Mhm.
So, really made me think about that today to the point I was thinking we should maybe do a meditation on that for them. But it's just really these subtle aspects that we take of when it comes to relationships. We all do this. It's not any one person, but we tend to come to relationships on the subtle level with a taking attitude. It looks like on the surface that we're giving, but when we look at the subtle level, we actually are expecting or desiring or wanting or hoping something. We're very self-absorbed, actually, and that's going to totally interfere with our relationships with each other because you've got two people coming together who want something from the other person. So we start to see disappointment, hurt feelings, disillusionment, conflict, because I came into it wanting something from that other person. Now,
Mm.
we have to be quite subtle to see that, because on the surface, we're saying, well, I'm upset with them because they did this, this, this to me. And if I look suddenly said, no, I wanted this from them and they didn't do it. They did what they needed to do, but they didn't do what I wanted them to do. So I came wanting something from them. They didn't deliver. And now I'm upset. And I think I'm very righteous in being upset.
Mhm.
And it's quite subtle what's going on. We call this the purity of our relationships. Um, so it's so important in terms of interacting. Am I coming into the relationship content?
Mhm. Mhm.
Not needy in any way, content. Some say, well, what kind of relationship? It's called a healthy relationship where I don't need anything from the other person. I just enjoy being in their company. It's quite healthy, actually. So that requires a lot of
Mhm.
subtle checking to have healthy relationships.
It's funny because where I work, no one likes to say hi to each other because they know that if they're saying hi, they need something from them.
Uh,
And so, but
yeah.
it was relevant why I was bringing that up in terms of something you had shared about you need to be there needs to be some subtlety inside to be able to recognize these things. So maybe this is the last question before we go into reflection is what do I need to develop inside in terms of my own personal practice to develop that subtlety?
It's a bit connected to that deepest, subtlest issue of worthiness, because what I'm going to need is a lot of self respect to be able to look at myself in an honest way and not be concerned about what I see, but really this feeling of I
Mhm.
really want to help myself. Whatever I see, I want to help myself. So that requires a lot of subtle belief in the self that I am very worthy. And it's not that there's something wrong with me, there's something right with me. And I really want to bring that out because then I'll start to look at myself in a more honest way, a more truthful way, to be able to really stop looking out there for why I'm feeling unhappy and start to look inside,
Mhm.
but not in a frightened way or a punitive way, but in a self respectful or pure way that I really want to understand
Mhm.
myself. It's almost exciting because I'm going to actually be able to get to the root of issues. So, being very honest with the self. And again, spiritual knowledge is helpful because it provides a mirror for us to look at ourselves in. So it just says, okay, these are the things that happens to the soul as it forgets itself. Do you see these things happening? Then you know, oh, the only issue I have is I forgot myself. It's not that so and so did this to me, or the soul becomes very reactive when it forgets itself. Great, great information. So if I find I'm being very reactive, now I know what's happened at the subtle level rather than
Mhm.
taking so much of my time going around getting angry at people, trying to fix people or whatever. I can help myself
Mhm.
much more quickly and effectively.
Might squeeze in one last question just
Okay.
because you brought something up at this time. Um, and it's really challenging for many.
Mm,
You hear that, you hear others share about it. I know it's, and what I feel like the subtle has always been important, but it feels
mm-hmm,
like it's now become sort of very
mm-hmm,
much in the limelight
mm-hmm,
that it's important.
mm-hmm. I agree. I remember when this so-called pandemic, this global, very unique scenes started to unfold, you could feel attitude was everything. And attitude's a very subtle thing. It was everything. It would become the most crucial thing, the attitudes that one has and works with. And sometimes we're completely blind to the attitude that we have, but it's really driving our thoughts. So, you know, it's so important to look at the subtle at this time, especially a soul's anxiety and fear and confusion escalate. And we tend to think it's because of the pandemic. It's because of the pandemic. Things will always happen. If it's not a pandemic, something else, something will always be happening out there. But coming full circle to the example at the beginning, how I experience it completely 100% depends on what's going on in here at the subtle level. Once I sort of figure that one out and see that clearly, again, looking honestly, that will be so useful because I can do something with what's going on in here. I can't, I can sit there and get very upset at the virus if I want. It's not even, it's just, it's not like it's, I can do that if I want. Um, that's not going to improve the quality of my life. Can I do something in here? What can I do in here? What invitation is these times giving me in terms of looking at the subtle, what's going on
Mhm.
inside? So it's very relevant to the current times.
Thank you, Judy. I think that was a good way to perhaps conclude tonight's session
Mm.
because it feels like it is something that we can often take for granted, very much so, until something else happens and you don't feel right inside and you don't know
Mm.
why. Right?
Yeah.
So perhaps maybe we'll transition to a little reflection.
As I sit here, I start to Observe the subtle activity inside my thoughts that lead to feelings. I look out through the eyes to experiment. And first, I try looking in a very neutral way. My eyes falling on different objects outside in a very neutral way, which means no judgment or commentary in my thoughts, just seeing the objects and then full stop. But then I try what I usually do. I look out at the objects around me and I start to have thoughts about what I see. Oh, that's a mess over there I have to clean up. Or, oh, that deadline, my project over there. It's amazing. The objects I'm looking at are completely neutral. They're not doing anything to me. But how I think about them shapes so deeply how I feel, which then shapes my decisions, which then shapes my actions, which then shapes my future. More and more, let me experiment with the possibility of different thoughts, and if I can, going deeper to attitude and even consciousness, using these subtle tools as I move through my physical world and checking the results, how it leads to different experiences of the same things. Om Shanti.
Well, thank you, Judy. I think it really invites us to actually watch our thoughts. Maybe unknowingly, we do a lot of controlling of them. And so maybe we avoid it because it's not a very fun experience. So maybe that will have to be a topic actually in terms of what that looks like inside on a useful intent. I'll pass it over to you just to let us know about upcoming sessions.
So, unbelievably, we are approaching the end of October. So, we will be posting quite soon our November schedule online. I believe it will be quite similar. There might be one or two new things happening, but these interviews will continue into November on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, with Thursday being more focus on the basics of Raj Yoga, the essentials. And the evening meditations, drop-in meditations, will continue on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday evenings. Saturday Inner Fitness will also continue 2 to 3 on the Zoom platform. So we'll update our website as soon as possible so that you'll be free to check there to see what's going on into November. Thank you so much for joining this evening. Until next time.